So how are the argument analyses coming along? I've spoken to some of you about it. Some of you find this to be the despair of your lives at the moment. It's just the worst thing that's happened to you all year. I'm sure if you, before this class, if you'd read a newspaper editorial, you'd have gone, oh, this is completely transparent what's going on here. It's incredibly easy to read and understand this. I hope that we brought you to a higher state of confusion in this class, that you're now confused in a much more complex and sophisticated way about your world. There's a couple of things that a bunch of people have noted. Yeah, Luke, yeah.
I almost think it would have been easier if we would have done something more complex. Just because it would have been geared towards argumentation in a more straightforward fashion.
That's a problem for a lot of those. So picking the thing to analyze is tricky, and I picked editorials because they're definitely framed in terms of a specific argument for something. A lot of texts like philosophy, I thought about doing some philosophy, but usually the arguments are like long, so it'd be like multi-page. It gets more and more complicated the longer it gets. So a couple things to note about these argument analyses. A few people have asked whether they have to use the specific title of it as the conclusion, and I think probably in both cases that's a bad move. So in both cases, focusing on this specific title as exactly what you meant the conclusion, as exactly what you pick out the conclusion to be, is probably not quite right. So one of them, the title is Canada needs to protect its biodiversity, and that doesn't seem to be quite right because the argument is that we need to do more to protect our biodiversity or something like that. And they don't mean Canada as in like the ground underneath our feet. They don't really mean Canada in terms of individual citizens either. So they mean something like the Canadian government needs to do more or something like that. So if you find yourself refining your conclusion in those ways, it's probably a good thing, right? So focus in on exactly what the argument was arguing for. Don't be, so the title advertises the point, but don't take it as the final point, okay? And do kind of be careful to not go way over the word count by identifying too many premises. You can combine premises, you can rephrase premises in simpler ways. The TA will have read probably 30 odd of each of them so that they will be fully aware of what the thing says. If you rephrase it in a short, snappy way, that's helpful for them to kind of keep it in their head and manipulate. So, any questions about that? Yeah. It's a good question, and I don't think I can answer it specifically. Like if you get to 20 premises, that's definitely too many. If you get to 15, you're pushing the upper limit. 10 is maybe what you might expect, 10 to 15 kind of range for these. These seem to have a bunch of premises in them. Like it's hard to narrow it down to less than 10, but you could, I mean, if you take just major points, you could get it under 10. And I don't think you'd be wrong to do that. It would just be a different strategy than the kind of fine-grained.
So then would we ignore certain premises in favor of other premises?
Yeah, so that's one strategy that you can use here is to say, look, I think this is kind of a minor point, or if once you've got your conclusion really clear and really fixed in your mind, if you find something that's maybe not going to that specific conclusion, just leave it out and mention that you left it out in the relevance section. So when you get to the relevance section, say, I didn't include this paragraph and this paragraph because they're not exactly on the conclusion that I identified. And so the marker will be looking for that to say like, okay, this person is focused on this conclusion, and given that that's the conclusion that they've identified, then yeah, these premises or these paragraphs don't get included as part of the argument. So that's one strategy for like paring down how much of the argument you're taking on. The other strategy is to do broader chunking of the premises. So maybe instead of, so I saw at least one student say on the healthcare one, instead of here are 5 reasons why healthcare is failing, they just said healthcare is failing. According to this report, healthcare is failing, premise 1. Right? So they chunked, instead of having 5 independent premises, they chunked it as just one big premise. And I don't think there's anything basically wrong with that if there's not a whole lot of structure in there for you to get at. Right? So it's a trade-off between how much of the structure you want to represent versus how much of the like big ideas of the argument are you trying to get at kind of thing. It's an art, really. So, which I know as those of you with formal training find that phrase to be just obnoxious as heck. But okay. Any more questions about the argument analysis? Yeah.
Not about the analysis.
Oh, anything? Any course questions?
Is there a lecture on Tuesday?
There is a lecture on, well, okay, so not a lecture. There is a meeting, a class meeting on Tuesday. So there's a makeup Monday on Tuesday. So all we're going to be doing is a kind of review, exam jam style thing. We'll just do practice problems. There's no new material there. So, you know, if you can't make it on Tuesday, it's not a catastrophe. So yeah, we're just doing exam review on Tuesday, but there will be a meeting. Yeah.
So like, what about if you have like a class on a normal Tuesday, then those don't count, or that'll just be a Monday class?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Classes are done on Thursday if you have it done.
Right. So yeah, this is like the semester officially ends on the Monday. It's the last technical day of class, and then the Tuesday is a makeup from the Monday we missed from the beginning of the semester, I believe, something like that.
Yeah, it was the first Monday.
The first Monday was a holiday, so that's the makeup. Yeah.
And then it's still in this room.
Still in this room. That's this time, this room, but on Tuesday instead of Monday. And we're just going to do review. We're just going to review for the exam, talk about exam stuff. Yeah. Yeah.
Are you going to post that like session on the
I suppose I could. I mean, I thought it would just be exercises kind of thing. So there wouldn't be, usually what I post is like the lecture section of it and the exercises, but if you want, do you want me to? If you're kind of indifferent, I won't bother, but you know, it'll be last minute kind of thing, like, you know, last minute review. I can if you want, yeah.
I'm just wondering, if you were to write the premises like as like the big chunk
Yep.
things,
Yep.
and then you, let's say in your actual diagram, you take them out, can you still keep them like the numbers for those like premises that you were to take out, and then just use those as reference for the relevance? So like you
I didn't
have your
follow
whole-
that. I didn't follow that.
So you have your whole list of premises, and let's say you took out 2 and 4 from your big.
Oh, okay.
thing,
No,
and
if
then-
you're not including something as a premise, don't write it in your list of premises.
Okay.
So if you're ignoring it as not super relevant,
Okay.
just leave it right out.
Okay.
Yeah. So then leave it out of your list, leave it out of your diagram. Only mention that you ignored it in the relevance section. Anything that you want to include as a premise, got to be in the list, got to be in the at least description of your structure.
Okay, great.
Yeah. Okay. Hopefully this should be a fairly quick class today. I don't really have all that much planned. I know I say that a lot. I think this time is actually true. So we're going to do, if there's no further questions, I mean, there's lots of time, but we'll get into it. So we're going to do relevance. So relevance is one of these steps, one of the 7 steps for assessing an argument between acceptability and adequacy. And once you know the acceptability of the premises and their relevance to the conclusion, it's pretty much just a matter of like putting those two together to figure out how adequate it was. So in your argument analyses, the adequacy section can be very short. It can be very short because you did all the explaining of whether you think the premises are either true or reasonably plausible in the acceptability section, and you did all your explaining about how they relate to each other and to the conclusion in the relevance section. So the adequacy section just does the math on that. They say, look, the premises were somewhat acceptable and they were highly relevant, therefore it's a somewhat adequate argument. Or the premises were unacceptable and irrelevant, so it's a totally inadequate argument, or whatever, right? So that section can be quite short. Right. So to focus, we're just going to focus on relevance today. We talk a little bit about it, so talk about it as a property, and then talk about a few of the fallacies of relevance. So in this context, relevant does not mean interesting or worthwhile or enlivening or any of those things. So relevance in a broader context means like it's important and interesting. In this context, we always mean relevant to a conclusion or to a sub-conclusion, right? So it's not the same thing as saying it's interesting or important in general. So with that in mind, it's a kind of error to talk about the relevance of a premise just as a premise, right? It's not that our premise is relevant, it's that a premise is relevant to a conclusion. It's a relational property. So don't tell me that this premise is highly relevant. Tell me it's highly relevant to establishing something else, yeah? Pretty straightforward. All right, and when you're explaining relevance, probably the best way, the nicest way to explain the relevance of two or more premises to a conclusion is to fit them into an argument pattern. If you've identified the argument pattern, you've said clearly how the premises are related to the conclusion. So P1, if P then Q, P2 is P, C, therefore Q. So why are P1 and P2 relevant to C? Well, they instantiate the argument pattern, modus ponens, or affirming the antecedent, right? So citing the argument pattern is telling us how these premises are related to the conclusion, how they're relevant to the conclusion. That's super nice if you're dealing with a deductive argument, or an argument that has a really clear argument pattern. And I think you'll probably found in the argument analysis that that's usually not the case. Like, it's awesome when this happens, because then you can say very, very clearly, this is an inductive generalization. This is modus tollens. This is a disjunction or disjunctive syllogism or something like that. And if you can say that, then you've said precisely how the premises are relevant to the conclusion. But it rarely works out that nicely, unfortunately, right? Like, as you were going through these, did you find a whole bunch of like nice argument patterns in your argument analyses? I wouldn't expect you to. Like, I would expect the arguments to be of unclear patterns. So the patterns of relevance are not as nicely laid out as they are here, right? So we can talk about formal and informal relevance. If you have an argument pattern, if you have a deductive argument pattern, then you've got all of the relevant facts. So all dogs are friendly, Gonzo is a dog, therefore Gonzo is friendly. There is nothing more that you need to know about the universe than P1 and P2 there to reach the conclusion. There are no further facts that could be relevant because it's a deductive argument, right? All of the relevant facts have been provided to you, and you can tell that because it's a deductive argument. Now, that's the nice case. The typical case is the informal one, where you've been given some of the relevant facts. Golden retrievers tend to be friendly dogs. Gonzo is a retriever, therefore Gonzo is likely to be friendly. Now, you've given some of the relevant facts here. You've given the breed of the dog, which is relevant to their disposition. However, if you know that Gonzo's had a terrible life, who's been neglected and had been mistreated, that's another relevant fact to determining whether Gonzo is likely to be friendly. Right? So if the argument pattern is not deductive like this, if it's not a tight deductive argument, then giving relevant facts is not the same as giving all of the relevant facts, right? And I'm sorry, once again, this is what you're far more likely to face, right? You're far more likely to see arguments in which some relevant facts are provided, but not all of the relevant facts. Yeah? One of the disappointing features of human discourse. So, when you're explaining informal relevance relations, you would say a premise is relevant to a conclusion if it makes it more likely for the conclusion to be true. That's what relevance means in the context of this class, that it raises the likelihood of the conclusion. So anything that you can say about how a premise does or does not raise the likelihood of a conclusion is explaining its relevance or its lack of relevance. So, I'll go through some examples from the textbook. You should vote for Johnson because she is honest and well-informed about the issues. So, I take it that that is a relevant premise for the conclusion because honesty and being well-informed are the properties that you want in an elected official, right? That's how those are relevant to the conclusion. Are those the only facts that you need to know? No, obviously not, right? Obviously, there are other facts that might be relevant to whether you should vote for Johnson. Like if your spouse is also running in the election, the fact that Johnson is honest and well-informed is not a sufficient reason to vote for Johnson. You'll make your spouse very mad if you vote for the other person, right? So, in informal contexts, you're given some of the relevant facts, not all of the relevant facts, and what makes it relevant is that it makes the conclusion more likely to be true. Not guaranteed, but more likely. Yeah? Okay, you should vote for Johnson because her mother used to be my kindergarten teacher. Relevant or irrelevant? Irrelevant. Somebody give me an example. How do you explain why that premise is irrelevant to the conclusion? Right, right. So being somebody's kindergarten teacher is probably not.
Like if that was a valid reason there, then how many people
Right. It would be kindergarten teachers taking over our public office, and then what would happen? Right. Right. So the way that you explain the relevance or irrelevance of a premise to a conclusion is to talk about how it either makes the conclusion more likely or fails to do so. So in this case, the normative claim is you should vote for Johnson, but the fact that her mother used to be your kindergarten teacher doesn't make that more likely to be true. Yeah? It doesn't give you a reason to believe it. And here's the ambiguous case. You should vote for Johnson because she's the only female candidate. Now there's something that most of our continent debated for months and months, not that long ago, right? The Hillary Clinton versus Donald Trump runoff was highly debated about whether this was a relevant or irrelevant premise. I kind of don't want to get into it about whether you think this is a relevant or an irrelevant premise to preserve what little goodwill we've got going on. But you can see, I hope that the point of this is just to show you that it's not always clear. It is not always obvious whether a premise is relevant or irrelevant. Sometimes that's the very point of contention. So explaining how this is or isn't relevant is going to be a much longer story than the first two, right? It's a much more complicated argument that you have to have. And relevance is just not always, like if you could always tell what's relevant to what, you would be finished the process of creating artificial intelligence, for example. That's judging things to be relevant or irrelevant, by the way, is the only thing, as far as I can tell, that distinguishes humans from machines at this point. Like that's the capacity that we all share that no computer has yet. Like if you tell it what's relevant, then a computer can figure out what to do. But figuring out what's relevant in the first place is something that currently, enjoy it while it lasts, because currently we're the only things on this planet that can do that. We'll see this time next year. But, all right. So formal and informal relevance. And this is just to apply that same, exactly what I was just saying to normativity, and it's sort of like a really tough case in normativity, because when you say something is good, or when you say it's good for something, that doesn't imply that it's always good under all circumstances, or that more of it is always better, right? So you're saying this is relevant to the goodness of an outcome, or that it's relevant, fertilizer is good for plant growth. So fertilizer has some relevance to plant growth, but you can't just stick any fertilizer on any plant. You got to get the right fertilizer for the right plant. And furthermore, you can't just grow plants in a pot of fertilizer, right? So just because it's good for plants doesn't mean that any given amount of it is good for plants. The point just being, something can be important without being the only thing that's important. And this is just exactly the same as the whole space of informal relevance relations, that something can be relevant without being the only thing that's relevant. Right? So when you're explaining the relevance of a premise, you want to say, this is or isn't relevant, this is or isn't the only thing that's relevant, and why. So, for example, you can accept protecting biodiversity is important without accepting, therefore we should shut down all industry whatsoever, right? You can say, this is a good thing, but it's not the only thing. Being able to feed ourselves is also a good thing. Yeah? Good. I think that's, yeah, okay, so that was relevance. That was the positive side of this. I don't really have much more to say about it than that. There really aren't good formal methods for identifying in informal contexts when a premise is relevant to a conclusion and when it isn't. Again, that's one of the deep, deep mysteries of cognitive science and the research in artificial intelligence is figuring out how to formalize that. We haven't got it yet. Yeah?
Is inferential strength or logical strength a good measure?
Yeah, I mean, so inferential strength is when you can measure inferential strength is when you're in a formal context. And when you're in a formal context, you can say what's relevant, right? So when you've got a deductive, or if you're playing a game of chess, like that's a formal context, so you can say what's relevant to whether you're going to be in checkmate or not, completely, and you can finish it, right? You can say everything that's relevant. The weather doesn't matter, the position of Venus doesn't matter, all that contextual stuff doesn't matter. It's only the pieces on the board and whose move it is that are relevant. So if you've got a well-specified formal context, you can completely say what's relevant, right? And you can say it by like, look, here are the statistical like facts, here are the deductive inferences that we've made, and you can clean out the problem of like saying all the things that are relevant. It's just that most of us, most of the time, don't have the luxury of existing in a purely formal environment. We deal with the messy world of the informal. So, yeah. Okay. Any more general questions about relevance? We are actually whipping through this. I think I have not deceived you this time. I think this actually might be a short class. A little slow clap there. I understand. Okay, so we're going to go through these 4 fallacies of relevance. These are ways that an argument can fail to connect premises relevantly to a conclusion. And we're going to do, once again, we're going to do like clear cases and unclear cases. And your job is to be able to tell the clear cases from the unclear cases. And in the unclear cases, you just say, this is unclear. Right? That's your only job here. So sometimes appeal to authority, the classic fallacy. So appeal to authority and ad hominem are the ones that I need you to get here. These are the ones that come up the most often in debate, and these are the ones that are by far the most abused of these fallacies. So appeal to authority. Sometimes appealing to authority is perfectly legitimate. Like you cannot get by in your life without appealing to authority for some of your premises. If you believe that you know the boiling point of water and you've never measured it, then you're appealing to authority, right? If you believe that Venus is a planet and not a pile of gas, you're appealing to authority, unless you've observed it yourself, right? So that's like almost everything that you know comes to you on the basis of some authority or other. Appealing to it is perfectly fine if the authority is legitimate. Often, however, people make illegitimate appeals to authority. So the fallacy of appeal to authority as a fallacy is when you make an illegitimate or irrelevant appeal. Yeah? And of course, often it's not clear. So here's one. Justin Trudeau, former math teacher, said that the internal angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. I would say that is a relevant appeal to authority. So on the basis of his authority as a former math teacher, Justin Trudeau is perfectly well situated to tell you how, what the internal angles of a triangle add up to. They wouldn't let you be a math teacher if you didn't know that, right? Yeah?
What if we change math teacher to drama teacher?
I think if you change it to drama teacher, then it would be an irrelevant appeal to authority.
What if you remove subject, former teacher?
Former teacher said the internal angles of the triangle add up to 180. Probably that's, I don't know, maybe that makes it more relevant. I would kind of want to know actually what kind of teacher they were. But yeah. Probably you don't need to appeal to authority in this case anyway. If you don't know that the internal angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees, maybe the fact that Justin Trudeau said so isn't going to convince you. And probably you should know that anyway, and you don't need anybody's authority to take as evidence for it, right? Yeah.
Well, what if you took out former math teacher? So that would be actually like a bad situation.
So Justin Trudeau said the internal angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees. Now, you might want to say, that's just irrelevant, right? So it's irrelevant that Justin Trudeau said it. That doesn't increase my likelihood of believing it. So it's an irrelevant appeal to authority. It's not a fallacy in the sense that you should no longer believe this, but it's just bringing up an authority where you didn't need to. Yeah?
Well, actually, in some sense, should you have the right not to believe? Because that didn't really, like that wasn't, there was no information really packed into that, other than you just have Justin Trudeau and what he said. He can say a lot of things, he's a human being.
One can, but in this case, he's got relevant authority, right?
Okay.
As a former math teacher, as a specialist in math, you should bloody well know how much the internal angles of a triangle add up to. So that's a relevant appeal to authority. It's an irrelevant appeal to authority in that you already knew that, so you didn't need to appeal to the authority. Okay, let's try another one. Justin Trudeau says that marijuana should be legalized. Consider this against the 2017 Angus Reid poll that reported that 63% of Canadians supported it, and 37% opposed, which I think is a fairly large number opposed. So this is not, by no means is this a settled issue in the Canadian public's mind, right? So, does the fact that Justin Trudeau said it make you believe it? Is that a good reason for you to believe it? So edit out of your mind for 1 second whether you already believe the truth of this. Forget what you think about marijuana. Is the fact that Justin Trudeau said it a reason for you to now believe it? Yeah.
Is this being answered in combination with his Angus Reid poll?
Well, this is just for context. So just consider.
So we're answering that question in the context of that survey then?
Well, I mean,
That seems like in a democracy that would be a reason that should be legalized. It's 63% for the other 37.
Okay. Okay, so, but that's not the reason. So forget about that. So we're not giving, so if I say 63% of Canadians support marijuana, therefore it should be legalized, that's a whole separate argument. So just on the fact that people don't already agree on this, that's all the poll was meant to show. Now consider whether Justin Trudeau saying it should be counted as evidence. Hang on, Nick, I got one. Yeah, I think he was.
Even if the poll, we take the poll into consideration, it's still an irrelevant appeal to authority because we're not appealing to Angus Reid, we're appealing to Justin Trudeau, who isn't the person who releases statistics.
Okay, so forget about the poll. This is just to forget about the poll. Just ask. All I want to know is the stuff in quotation marks are relevant or irrelevant appeal to authority? Is it?
Even with it, it's not relevant, and so without it, it's still irrelevant.
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
Well, also, Justin Trudeau is part of, the Liberal Party, and we know the Liberal Party is more likely to be for legalization of marijuana versus the Conservatives. So that gives you a reason to maybe believe that Justin Trudeau thinks it should be, but whether or not it actually should be, I think is
And that's the question. So the question here is this a reason for you to believe that marijuana should be legalized? Yeah.
I don't know if this makes sense, but could you say that it is because, okay, as like a politician, he's somebody that everyone voted for to kind of make these types of decisions for, the society or whatever. So based on that fact and the fact that he is someone with knowledge of those types of things, I would say that you could say it's relevant because it's not just saying Ronald McDonald said it should be legalized.
Yeah.
It's somebody that is concerned with those issues.
Okay, so I'd like to tease out a couple things there. So I thought you made some interesting points, but I'd like to separate them out from the points that I think make this an irrelevant appeal to authority. So the fact that Canadians voted for this guy and he said, I'm going to legalize marijuana, does seem relevant to whether we should legalize it. So the fact we live in a democracy, we all collectively agreed to sort of live by the decisions of the majority, and furthermore, the majority voted for this thing, give us reasons to believe that we should legalize it. The fact that he said this doesn't seem to me the same as that. So the fact that we all voted for it is a good reason to believe that it should be legalized. The fact that Justin Trudeau said so, and said so before we voted for him as well. This is also true before we all went to the polls and I mean, we didn't all vote for him, but we as a voting public, the majority of us decided to elect him. He said this before that as well. And back then, this was not a reason to believe it. Just the fact that he said it was not a reason to believe it. Because he's got a kind of authority, right? He's got a public authority. Even before he was prime minister, he had a kind of he was an MP and that stuff. So he's got authority, but it's not the kind of authority that's relevant to deciding that kind of moral question, right? Just the fact that he holds public office doesn't automatically make his moral opinions correct, right?
But didn't he get to that place based on his moral opinions that people voted for? So then isn't he a representative of the people?
So if we're saying this post-legalization, yes, but, so that's correct. But just the fact that he said it is not what makes you believe that it's morally justified, right? So once again, it's the fact that we all voted for it that is the good part of this argument that you're making, not the fact that this guy said it.
So if you added in the same premise, which is you voted for him,
Right. Right. That would be an appeal to something other than authority. That would be an appeal to sort of popular opinion or something like that. Hang on, Nick. I gotta. Yeah.
You guys keep talking about two different things. She's talking about voting for him as in the person, and you talking about voting for it as in the poll. Are you talking about as well voting for him?
No, I was talking about voted for him.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Okay. We could talk about one more and then we'll move on. Yeah.
Sorry. So it's a relevant appeal to authority, but maybe not the only relevant appeal to authority.
Okay.
Because Justin Trudeau, I can say that Justin Trudeau likely is invested in Canadian issues of economics and crime and so forth, that he would have maybe an educated opinion on the topic. So therefore, it's kind of might be a relevant appeal to opinion, just based on who he is and what he does.
So that's exactly the sort of consideration that you'd bring to bear to show that it's a relevant appeal to authority, that it's a good appeal to authority. Does this person have the information that they would need to make a good decision about this, and are they unbiased? So if you believe that Justin Trudeau is a sort of a well-informed, unbiased defender of the good of the nation, then the fact that he said something does actually weigh on whether you should believe it or not. So that would be what would make this a relevant appeal to authority. Now, I'm not suggesting that you all need to believe that, just that if you did, then it would be a relevant appeal to authority. Okay, let's keep moving. So here's a knockdown one. So Justin Trudeau asked the Governor General to dissolve Parliament and issue the writ of election. This is what happens when they want to run an election. And this is an appeal to authority in the sense that, is it okay for him to have done this? Yes, because he's the Prime Minister. He's indisputably the Prime Minister, and this is indisputably one of the things that the Prime Minister is allowed to do, right? Just by the Constitution of the country. So just because he's in authority doesn't make the things that he does wrong. So appealing to authority in this sense doesn't make him automatically wrong if you've got the relevant kind of authority. Yeah? So here are the questions. Here are the questions that you should ask yourself when you're looking at an appeal to authority. Here's how you decide whether it's a good one or not. Does the person have the relevant kind of authority? So he was a math teacher, so he got some authority on talking about math. I mean, he's a prime minister, which means he has the authority to do things like dissolve parliament and ask for an election. Does he have the authority to tell us what's right and wrong independently of what his party thinks? Maybe. All right. Are they likely to be biased or unbiased on the topic? I think this is Nick was saying, like, look, he's a liberal. Of course he's going to say this. So you might think his position in his party actually makes him less likely to be unbiased, and therefore it's not a legitimate appeal to authority. So if you're an authority on something, but you're a biased authority, like 99% of priests believe in God, therefore God must exist because they're theological authorities. Well, they're kind of biased, right? The fact that they're priests makes them kind of biased towards one side of that debate, right? So citing priestly authority on whether God exists or not, it doesn't convince me anyway. I'm unmoved that precisely because they have the relevant kind of authority, but they're biased. Right? The position that they occupy biases them to one view over the other. Other questions you could ask: is there an expert consensus, or is the topic a controversial one even amongst experts? So you can't just cite a philosopher who says numbers are real; they're discovered rather than invented. Math is real; it's discovered rather than invented. Because philosophers debate this thing, right? So if 50% of the experts say one thing, 50% of the others say another, saying, well, this expert said it, really doesn't resolve the issue, right? So there has to be some kind of agreement amongst experts, or maybe even expert consensus. And furthermore, the expert consensus has to be credible. So 100% of astrologers will tell you that astrology is true. They're experts in astrology, they should know. Well, that's dumb, don't believe that. Because their so-called expert consensus is not based on any kind of credible knowledge or basis of knowledge, right? I'm sorry if you believe in astrology. Obviously I do not. Okay. Yeah? Okay, so these are the basic questions. When you're facing an appeal to authority, you ask yourself, is this person the right kind of authority? Are they likely to be biased? Is there an expert consensus? And is that consensus credible? Yeah? So if a scientist tells you the atomic weight of gold, and all scientists agree on the atomic weight of gold, and you have good reason to believe that they know what the atomic weight of gold is, that's a credible, relevant argument from authority. Yeah? Okay, moving on. Ad hominem. It's my other favorite. The most abused of all of the abused things that people hurl at other people on arguments on the internet, appeal to authority and ad hominem are easily at the top. Ad hominem means literally against the person. It's Latin. We use Latin to impress and intimidate our enemies. So it means literally against the person. So it is not an ad hominem fallacy to just say bad things about people. In a literal sense, it's ad hominem in the sense that you're saying it about the person, you're targeting the person, but it's not an ad hominem fallacy just to talk bad about somebody. So criticism is not necessarily an ad hominem fallacy. The fallacy is to say that somebody is wrong because they're a bad person. Yeah.
So I could say like, person A sucks,
Yeah.
and just leave it there, but if I say he sucks because the liberal or something, like, that.
No, you want it the other way. Don't believe them because they're a liberal.
Oh, yeah, okay, right.
That would be an ad hominem fallacy. So you're saying, or don't believe them because they suck, I guess would be the better one. Liberal's not necessarily derogatory, at least. Okay, so your multiple arrests for reckless driving make you unsuitable as a bus driver. Is that a good is that an ad hominem fallacy or a perfectly reasonable argument? It's a perfectly reasonable argument. It's directed against the character of the person. You're saying, you're not a good driver, and I can tell that because you've been arrested multiple times for reckless driving. And I think that's all right evidence that somebody is not a good driver, and therefore unsuitable as a bus driver, right? Yeah? So it's directed against the person. You hurt their feelings, probably. They didn't like it. You know, it's negative. It might be rhetorically ugly. You know, you might lose a friend, so it may be ill-advised in all of those senses, but it's not a fallacy to say, you're a bad driver, I know because you've been arrested a bunch of times for reckless driving. Okay. Your analysis of the data is all wrong, you forgot to carry the two, you jerk. Ad hominem fallacy or perfectly sensible argument with some stank on it? It's the stank, right? It's a perfectly good argument, and then you add some like personal insult on top of it. Once again, this is not a fallacy because you're not saying that you're wrong because you're a jerk. You're saying you're wrong and then also adding a personal insult on top of it. So insulting people, again, don't do it like just for fun. And you're not gonna like, you can imagine like, how well is this conversation gonna go from that point? Do you think they're gonna have a productive, healthy, nice interaction, or are they pretty much done after that? They're done, right? This is the conversation in terms of actually exchanging ideas is over. So in a debate, don't do this, but it's not a fallacy, and it's specifically not the fallacy of ad hominem. Okay? You can't trust the prime minister. Anyone in power is only looking out for themselves.
Fallacy.
Yeah? Why?
Because you're discrediting the person based on who they are. Genetic fallacy.
A genetic fallacy. Interesting. Okay. Yeah. I think this one's actually debatable. I think this is debatable. Because you're giving a reason why their character might not be credible. It might not be a good evidence. So I think this might be a different fallacy. So as you're right, it's a genetic fallacy, not an ad hominem fallacy. So
Genetic fallacy is like under the umbrella of that hominem.
Is it?
Technically, it's like a personal attack, right?
Okay. I think this is debatable. Yeah.
I don't think that's a personal attack because that's only if you think there's something wrong with only looking out for yourself, right?
Sure.
Maybe it's just saying that in this situation, if you need to look out for yourself, don't trust someone else because their objective is to look out for their own self. So in that sense, I would say it's not just an insult, it's actually an argument.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with you in the sense that it's kind of debatable, but like, could we agree that like if you say it in a certain way, you can actually imply because there's a lot of information contained in the way you say it, like
Right.
You can't trust the prime minister, anyone looking for power, looking out for themselves. Like if you say it in that way, like it kind of implies that you're trying to say something like derogative, but kind of politely.
Even if you're saying something derogatory, like again, and this is the important point, like dogging somebody is not to commit this fallacy. Being mean is not to commit this fallacy. Being rude is not to commit this fallacy. Only saying that somebody's wrong because they're a bad person is committing this fallacy. And in this case, they're saying, look, here's a principle that you might believe. The more power you have, the more self-serving you are, because only people who are self-serving get to have power. So don't trust anybody with power. Now I think that's maybe not a great argument, because lots of people who have power who are nice. I've met lots of people who are nice who have power. I mean, it doesn't seem to be a great argument, but it's not ad hominem. Okay, let's keep going. So here's a special case of that, the Cloak Way fallacy, or U2. It's a certain type of ad hominem, which says, this is the error of trying to refute somebody's reasoning by saying that they too are guilty of something. So just because somebody's a hypocrite doesn't make them wrong. So I put up Richard Pryor here. Richard Pryor tells this great story about when he was badly addicted to freebase cocaine. And his friends would come to him and say, Richard, it's ruining your life. You got to stop, man. You got to stop. This is going to destroy you. But while I'm here, can I have a little bit? So Richard's friends were correct. They were right that it was ruining his life and he had to get out from under it, or it would have destroyed him. They were not wrong because they also hit the pipe a little. It doesn't make you wrong just because you're a hypocrite. The thing that you're saying is not automatically incorrect just because you're not living up to it yourself. Right? His friends were right, even though they were hypocrites. Right? Okay, so this is Cloak Way. Yeah.
Could you have reason to believe that a hypocrite's argument is wrong?
Of course. I mean, in general, of course. I mean, you could have.
They are a hypocrite, simply for the fact that they're a hypocrite. So it's like someone tells you, you shouldn't eat meat, and then they eat meat, and then your logic would be, this person doesn't believe what they say, therefore what they say likely isn't true. Something like that.
I think it's like really common for there to be like that Cloak Way, but with the person that's like feeling the illegitimate appeal of authority. Typically, like when you say like, oh, well, you did it too, but then that person's really no position to be saying anything.
Right.
Or to have done that. Like,
I think it's helpful at this point to distinguish the rhetorical strength of an argument from the logical strength of an argument. So if you're speaking from a place of sincerity and everybody knows that you're honest and you mean what you're saying, you're far, far more convincing. Like Richard's friends would have been much more convincing if they didn't have a little bit of his freebase, right? So he would have been in a much better position to offer their argument, much more convincing. But we need to distinguish what's convincing from what's logically sound. So they were not wrong in any sense. Yeah.
So would you say it's kind of like when parents say, do as I say, not as I do?
Yeah, right. So they're not necessarily wrong when they say, like, don't steal cars. I know I stole a couple cars in my youth, but you shouldn't. I mean, it doesn't automatically make them wrong. Yeah.
What about the doctor who smokes but tells you not to smoke?
Well, he's right. You shouldn't smoke.
Don't discredit his advice?
No, I don't think so. I mean, if the doctor's advice is based on sound statistical studies of the health hazards of smoking, he says, look, we've done all the research. I can tell this is really bad for you. And despite that, he's still smoking. Then he's not wrong. If he tells you that it's easy to quit, then he might be wrong. Because then his behavior is evidence that, like, oh, this is actually much more challenging than I thought. But if he's just telling you that it's bad for you, even if he's smoking, that doesn't make him wrong. He could still be wrong for other reasons, but that doesn't make him wrong. I see a hand over there, or is this good? Okay, so this is a specific version of the ad hominem fallacy, the U2 fallacy, Cloak Way. And again, if you use these names on people, they'll just be super annoyed. It won't help you at all. It will not help you explain your argument. It will not help you win the argument. They'll just find you really annoying. Okay. But now you know the name, and if somebody tries it on you, you'll be well prepared. Right. Another fallacy of relevance is the straw man fallacy, where one person interprets another uncharitably by reading their conclusion as being much stronger than it is. So just a note on strength, because this is kind of weird. So you can talk about the strength of the argument as a whole. You can talk about the strength of the premises, and you can talk about the strength of the conclusion. And these things do not vary in a sensible way. It's a sensible way, but it's tricky. So a strong conclusion requires very strong premises, right, in order to establish it. So you need a really strong argument for strong conclusions, which means that if you interpret somebody as making a really strong claim, you're kind of being uncharitable to them. So if you say, dogs are friendly, and you're like, oh, you say all dogs are friendly? That's what you're doing is interpreting their claim as being much stronger than it is, which means whatever evidence they presented will seem weaker in comparison. So the stronger the conclusion, the weaker the argument, unless you provide stronger premises. So strength is weird here. So we talk about the strength of premises, the conclusion, and the inferential relation. But strawman fallacy is just saying, really over-interpreting the conclusion that somebody's trying to draw and trying to make their argument look weaker by attributing to them a stronger conclusion than they meant. Right? Okay, I take it that that's fairly I don't have to go through that in detail, right? Okay, good. Finally, the balance fallacy. So, is this the final? Yes, no, that's the final one. So, people often comment online and in arguments that they thought an argument was one-sided. And that's a perfectly legitimate thing to say in arguments where there are two valid sides. But in arguments where there's only one valid side, that's a foolish thing to say. So if a toddler decides to dump dish soap on the dog, and the mom comes in and says, don't do that, she doesn't like it, and you're making a mess. And the toddler says, well, you presented one side of the argument, but I find your presentation very biased and one-sided. I would like to hear the pro-dumping dish soap on the dog argument before we decide this issue. The toddler has made a balance fallacy. Very clever toddler, but he's still committed a fallacy, right? Because some things there just aren't two sides for, right? So if your kid is drinking bleach, you slap it out of their hand and say, don't drink bleach. They say, well, what about the upsides of drinking bleach? You didn't even tell me. You only presented one side of the argument. You have to give me a balanced reason for not drinking the bleach, or else I'm going to take a swig. That's a fallacy of balance. And it's a fallacy because what they're saying is a fallacy of relevance because what you're saying is, you haven't presented all the relevant information. And it's a fallacy just in case there is no more relevant information. When there's not another side to the story, calling the argument one-sided is just an error. And this is a perfect example of why citing fallacies is unhelpful in an actual conversation. Because if you tell somebody, you committed the balance fallacy because there's only one legitimate side to this argument, you're going to say, well, no, there's two. And now you're exactly back where you were before you busted out this fancy term for a fallacy. So explaining why, just cut out the talking about the fallacy part and just explain why there's only one legitimate side to the argument, right? So don't mention this. This is like, in anime when they yell out the name of the move they're doing, like, tornado punch. You would never do that in an actual fight for a variety of reasons. You would look foolish, you're advertising what you're doing, like you don't do that. Similarly, philosophers don't typically name the names of the fallacies when you're in a debate, and people really don't do this either. So you'll just be like one of the anime characters yelling out the name of their move if you name the fallacies in an actual conversation. This is for purposes of your education, not for use on people. Yeah?
So is this like, there's like another example of that, like when you talk about like the flat earthers, they're like trying to argue that it's like flat, but there's like an overwhelming consensus that it is.
That's right.
That it isn't, but they're like trying to say, well, we have the right to say like our,
right.
Which is more like a freedom of speech thing than it is like.
So yeah, if a flat earther tells you, well, you've only presented the round earth side of the argument, they've committed the balance fallacy. They're trying to get you to admit that there's two sides to an issue of which there is only one reasonable side. Yeah. Okay. So those are the fallacies of relevance. Illegitimate appeal to authority. So appeals to authority is not itself a fallacy. Illegitimate appeal to authority is a fallacy. Ad hominem, attacking the man. Just saying mean stuff is not an ad hominem fallacy. Saying somebody's wrong because they're a bad person is a fallacy. Similarly, straw man is a fallacy of relevance because you've changed the conclusion that somebody is trying to draw, so you've changed the relationship. Relevance is about the relationship between premises and a conclusion, and you've changed the relation. And the balance fallacy is, again, a fallacy of relevance because it's a fallacy about whether there are other relevant facts or not. Okay, so I have